In this video, we'll dig deep into the 1971 prog rock classic, The Fountain of Salmacis by the band Genesis. It's one of my all-time favourite rock songs, and it was this song that introduced me to the myth of Salmacis and Hermaphroditus. The most famous, and the only lengthy surviving ancient source for this myth is found in Book 4 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, although another source was discovered in the mid-1990s, long after the song was recorded. So, let's explore The Fountain of Salmacis, the song, its Ovidian source, and the wider mythological backdrop. Welcome to Ancient Classics. If you haven't already, remember to like and subscribe. The band Genesis was formed in the late 1960s. By 1971, they had released a couple of albums, but hadn't really made a significant mark yet. Their drummer and guitarist left the band, leaving three core members: Tony Banks on keys, Mike Rutherford on bass, and Peter Gabriel on vocals and dodgy flute. In 1970 or 71, they recruited two new members, guitarist Steve Hackett and drummer Phil Collins. This lineup lasted until Peter Gabriel left the band in 1975, whereupon Phil Collins took over as singer. Many, myself included, consider this lineup, the 1971-75 lineup, to be the band's greatest, the one that produced the most exciting and interesting music, far surpassing their pop material from the 1980s. Not everyone agrees, though. To quote investment banker Patrick Bateman, "I've been a big Genesis fan ever since the release of their 1980 album Duke. Before that, I didn't really understand any of their work. All the albums before Duke seemed too artsy, too intellectual. It was Duke where the music got more modern. The lyrics started getting less mystical and more specific, maybe because of Peter Gabriel's departure." The 1971-75 lineup released four classic albums, starting with Nursery, Cryme, which was released in November 1971. The final track on that album was The Fountain of Salmacis, or Salmacis. It's one of my favourite rock songs, and it rewards close and repeated listening. I've added a link to the original and to two excellent recent covers in the video description, so check them out. At 8 minutes long, it's on the long-ish side for a rock song, less so compared to prog rock songs from that era. But it's actually very well structured and concise. Musically, lyrically, and dramatically, it achieves a lot in those 8 minutes. And there's absolutely zero flab, a rockapillion if you like. Before we break the song down, let's take a look at the ancient source, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Anyone coming to this from a classics background will need no introduction to Ovid. But for everybody else, Ovid, or Publius Ovidius Naso, was born around 43 BCE in Sulmo. He was active during the time of the Roman Emperor Augustus and was part of that scene until he got cancelled and sent to Romania. Ovid's masterwork was the Metamorphoses in 15 books, equating to a medium-ish sized novel in length. The Metamorphoses is one of those works that defies, even mocks, easy categorization. Owing to its length and its meter hexameters, it's often categorized as an epic, and it kind of is, but its scope encompasses the creation of the universe through to Ovid's time and beyond, with the deification of Augustus. And along the way, it takes on hundreds of Greco-Roman myths, shifting between genres and modes of expression along the way. The different stories are all interwoven together using a variety of narrative and structural techniques with inset narratives, subplots, stories within stories. It's pretty mind-blowing. And the tale of Salmacis and Hermaphroditus is one such tale within a tale. It's the last of several tales told by the daughters of Minyas, which itself is a kind of a narrative strand linked to a whole load of stuff that goes on in Thebes, but never mind about that. Ovid portrays one of the daughters, Alcatoe, as taking her turn to tell a story. In a kind of recusatio trope, she mentions various tales that she could tell but won't, and instead proclaims, "I will entertain you with a sweet new tale." Ovid's Alcatoe is therefore proclaiming the novelty of her tale. But what's novel about it? Is it actually an invention of Ovid's? Perhaps. Maybe we'll come back to Ovid's possible sources in another video. Alcatoe then signals that her tale is going to be an etiological tale, a story about how something came to be. She indicates too that the phenomenon in question is well known, but not its cause. Learn now how the Fountain of Salmacis earned its enervating power, how it turns bodies that touch it soft. Though the power of that fountain is well known, the cause is obscure. The tale itself stretches over 100 lines. In essence, the features common to both Ovid's and Genesis's versions are as follows. Hermaphroditus, the son of the gods Hermes and Aphrodite, is raised by nymphs in a cave on or near Mount Ida. As a young man, he travels afar and finds a pool or lake. There resides Salmacis, a naiad or water nymph. Salmacis lusts after Hermaphroditus and tries to seduce him. Her advances are rejected, so she assaults Hermaphroditus. As she grabs him, their bodies are transformed, fused together as one. Then they retreat to the pool, and Hermaphroditus, still somehow able to speak, utters a curse that anyone who touches the waters should suffer a like fate. But back to the song now. It's not your standard verse, chorus, mid-eight, chorus, pop song structure. I'm going to represent the structure broadly like this. There are 4 sections, which are repeated with variations and extensions. We'll call them the Mellotron swell, A section, B section, and C section. Then a through-composed, largely instrumental mid-section and a bridge, which forms the basis, though with quite some development, of a coda, and a composed outro section with guitar solo. The Mellotron swell, as I term it, is one of the most recognizable motifs. It features at several points, including in a curtailed form at the end. I call it the Mellotron swell because over an arpeggiated Hammond organ figure, it features this kind of swelling crescendo figure, played on the mellotron, highlighted by Phil Collins' cymbals. The mellotron is a pretty cool instrument. It is not a synthesizer, but rather a kind of mechanical sampler. It was a keyboard instrument which triggered tape loops. There were several tape settings. The standard ones were a choir, strings, and flutes. It was pretty unreliable, from what I understand, and seemed to always get out of tune because the tape would get distorted. But that was its beauty. It had this warped, twisted vibe to it. I don't know what the hell it was developed for. I guess expensive but cheesy home entertainment and lounge music, I guess. There's a really cringe commercial on YouTube from 1965.
Hello there. I suppose you thought you were listening to a long playing record just then. Well, you weren't.
Apparently, Princess Margaret was also an early adopter. But the mellotron soon found its, albeit short-lived, role in rock music. An early and perhaps the most famous example is the fake flute intro to the Beatles' Strawberry Fields. But the mellotron really came into its own with the first generation of the prog rock bands. King Crimson's Court of the Crimson King is a locus classicus. Here, the mellotron, using a strings sound, is the perfect foil to the medieval fantasy tune. In fact, according to a YouTube video posted by guitarist Steve Hackett, Genesis bought King Crimson's mellotron off their leader Robert Fripp. In the same YouTube video, Hackett describes how the band hired George Martin's studio just to find a large enough recording space in which the swell could grow to its full potential. It's a really powerful motif, and one which apparently the band had envisaged for an earlier unrecorded song. Whatever, it's just perfect here. It gives the piece the distinctive, otherworldly, somewhat creepy vibe, perfect for this dark and subverted romance cum body horror. The swell motif also has a structural organizing function, appearing at key moments throughout the piece. So after the first mellotron swell, we have the A section, as I'm terming it. Harmonically, there's not too much to it. It centers around E minor, nor is there anything too remarkable about the melody. But underpinning it is the beginnings of a tight, galloping, almost jazz fusion groove from Phil Collins, locked in tight with Mike Rutherford's bass. And Peter Gabriel begins his narrative. His voice throughout this piece is quite remarkable. It's reedy, fragile, just on the cusp of fracturing, but never quite. It's an evocative start and sets the mythic scene perfectly. It introduces a dark, problematic sexual tension, earlier than Ovid's version does. Sure, the idea of Hermaphroditus being raised by nymphs on Ida comes straight from Ovid. But why do the nymphs keep a child? One raises a child, but one keeps a mistress, a pet, or a captive. And why is Hermaphroditus so afraid of their love? That's not in Ovid. There's no way the band could have known this because the source wasn't discovered until 20 years later. But in one version of the myth, it is suggested that Hermaphroditus was raised by Salmacis herself. We then have the next structural element, with a different chord sequence, which I'll call the B section. Harmonically, it's rooted around an A pedal bass. So this section narrates Hermaphroditus' wanderings and his discovery of Salmacis' abode. The band here are departing quite significantly from the Ovidian model. In the Metamorphoses, Hermaphroditus travels far afield from Mount Ida to the land of the Carians, Lycia. Indeed, the Fountain of Salmacis was located near Halicarnassus, although Ovid doesn't specify that. The band present Hermaphroditus as a hunter, lost in the forest. Though Ovid doesn't describe Hermaphroditus as a hunter, there's something very Ovidian about this description. We're used to cliches about hunters hunting after prey as a metaphor for the hunt for a sexual partner or victim. Or one could refer to the more common near synonym, a predator. Indeed, Peter Gabriel sings of Hermaphroditus' desire for conquest, another cliche, or so it seems. Because in this myth, it's the female nymph Salmacis who is the predator. Ovid does a similar kind of thing in his presentation of Salmacis, rather than Hermaphroditus. In Ovid's version, we first encounter Salmacis gathering flowers. And in Greco-Roman poetry, women and nymphs are typically shown gathering flowers before they are assaulted as passive victims by a man or god. So both Genesis and Ovid, in their different ways, are invoking the traditional tropes of a predatory male and unwitting, unwilling female victim, only to subvert the trope and reverse the roles as the narrative progresses. We then have another musical section with a slight but not drastic key modulation to, I think it's a D pedal over G or something like that. We'll call this the C section, or perhaps chorus, because it serves a similar function, but it's not any kind of repeating refrain. Each C section features two simultaneous vocal lines, one contrasting with the other. Here's the first one. Each line ends with a homophone, my father, no father, your son, guided by the sun. One is in the voice of Hermaphroditus himself, the other the third-person narrator, in whose voice Gabriel has been singing thus far. Next, we move back to a second B section, omitting the A section. This continues the narrative and builds up the tension. Now a C or chorus section again, with the contrasting simultaneous voices. Both voices are those of third-person narrators, but the second voice is more knowing than that of the first. Not some creature, but the Naiad queen Salmacis. The tension's mounting, about to break. But musically and lyrically, Genesis puts on the brakes, allowing the tension to escalate further still. They do this by returning to the A section, which had been omitted in the previous round. So thus far we've heard the voice of the third-person narrator, or narrators, and Hermaphroditus, and now Salmacis is given a voice, a liquid voice at that. Check out also the elemental physicality. Hermaphroditus' breath is heated, brushing through the cool mist, and Salmacis has a liquid voice. Already we have a hint that their voices, their breath, and soon their bodies are physically mixing. Now another dual voice C, or chorus section. At this point, the tune goes full prog mode, with a 2.5 minute through-composed, largely instrumental passage. It's the scene where Salmacis attempts to seduce Hermaphroditus and, rebuffed, assaults him. Gabriel wisely avoids trying to narrate it, save for a brief section directly quoting the two characters. Instead, we have a through-composed instrumental section, and it's here that Phil Collins' drums and Mike Rutherford's bass really come into their element. This track is very much a group effort. Everyone adds their essential elements to it. Collins and Rutherford had thus far been providing a tight groove throughout, but their lines become more active, pushed to the forefront, narrating, if you like, the struggle. This is probably the most jazz fusion Phil Collins gets with Genesis. Later in the 70s had a jazz fusion side project, Brand X, though that side of him kind of fell by the wayside with his massive middle-of-the-road pop success in the 80s. There's not much jazz at all in what Rutherford is playing, though he works well with and complements Collins nonetheless. Rutherford's punchy pick playing, rather, is more akin to what, say, Chris Squire was doing with Yes at the time, and one can kind of feel some of the sensibilities here that would later emerge with the next generation of prog metal bands like Dream Theater in the 1990s. Anyway, you really just got to check it out. Then there's a second vocal passage, a bridge, if you like, towards this midsection, a new structural element, one which will resurface later on. It's the moment of Metamorphoses, where Hermaphroditus and Salmacis' bodies are fused. Ovid's way more explicit here, by the way, and he draws out the struggle and transformation in full detail. That's Ovid's thing, you see. I mean, the clue's in the name, Metamorphoses. And there's a risk that anyone else would mishandle this and make it seem ridiculous or demeaning. So Genesis were right to cut back the lyrics in this section and let the music and listener's imagination do the rest. The through-composed midsection is brought to a close by a return of the Mellotron swell. See how it's a powerful structuring device, giving a sense of clear transition. Coming after the turmoil, it discharges some of the tension but takes on a new kind of flavour. Then back to the B form, and the slower paced narrative resumes, but then is taken up again with the two characters' voices. But Hermaphroditus' curse is followed by a dual-voiced chorus C section featuring Salmacis' triumphant cry and the narrator's commentary. Pause for a second. When discussing and considering the tale of Hermaphroditus and Salmacis, the theme of gender immediately springs to mind. A lot has been written about Ovid's portrayal of gender, and I don't intend to go over that ground here. Personally, I'm not so sure this myth, and certainly not Genesis's presentation of this myth, has much to do with gender per se. Even Ovid, who most certainly was interested in exploring gender, doesn't focus especially on any kind of nuanced exploration in this myth. Elsewhere, Ovid does, and there are several accounts of persons transitioning during the Metamorphoses, notably Caeneus and Iphis and Tiresias, who transitions and then detransitions over the course of their life. Ovid gives each of those characters a complex, nuanced and multifaceted treatment. Whatever one's views might be about Ovid, one must accept that he gives his characters the respect of each having an individual voice and experience. That's not what I believe we have here in the tale of Hermaphroditus and Salmacis, at least not in Genesis's version. Rather, I see this story, or Genesis's presentation, as being more an exploration of sexuality, sexual violence, consent, and human identity. See, what happens to Hermaphroditus is fundamentally non-consensual, and as a result of it, both he and the perpetrator, Salmacis, are dehumanized. They become, in Genesis's word, a creature, one to which gender is irrelevant. But even after their fusion, their identities are not wholly lost, and we hear each, Hermaphroditus and Salmacis, speak, but separately. The fused entity is never given a voice of their own, again suggesting that as a united entity, they are lost to themselves. The last sung passage is a coda, based loosely on the bridge from the instrumental section. The final passage is presented as if it is a romantic conclusion. A lover's dream had been fulfilled. But note that it is only one lover's dream, yet both have given themselves to it. And there they remain, still beneath the lake, as if in death. It's dark, creepy, conflicted, and gives a kind of imperfect lyrical resolution. But the piece ends with an instrumental passage, featuring an emotive guitar solo from Hackett. It's beautiful, glorious, almost wistful, leaving us asking just what kind of love song have we just listened to? But at the very end comes a truncated version of the opening Mellotron swell, closing much as it began. And there we have it. in 8 minutes of tightly structured music, with evocative lyrics based on Ovid but departing in interesting ways. It all works together, and there's not one wasted second. For a prog rock tune, it's damn tight. In another video, we might revisit this particular myth and its tellings, going back before Ovid and forward to the reception of Salmacis and Hermaphroditus in more recent times. Until then, like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon.